Well, hi, everybody. It's John Elzinga, and welcome back to It's a Great Day to Serve the Lord. And today, this devotional is about how grace works. How does this thing called grace that God gives us, that God bestows upon us, how does this thing really work? I mean, and we use the word a lot, especially in evangelical circles. We use that word grace a lot. There are so many churches with the word grace in the title of the church. We use it a lot, and most of us understand what it means, we get what it means, but there is some misunderstanding about what grace really means. Some mistake grace for denial of sin, that some sin is not sin because of grace. So let's talk and start with a simple definition of grace. It's the best I've ever heard, seen, known about, and it is defined as unmerited favor. Unmerited favor. Unmerited meaning grace that is not grace if it is merited, if it is worked for, if it is won, established, created by us in any way because of a good account, because of how good of a person we are, because of something that we've done, something that we have worked for. That's really what it means. Simple translation, I don't deserve grace if I've worked for it, even if I'm good. And it's not about our goodness, because if it was all about our goodness, that is to say our salvation, that is to say our eternity, if it's about our goodness, then how good is good enough, and who gets to decide? So here's the thing about grace. Grace is not grace unless there has been sin. We know nothing of grace unless there has been sin. Romans 7:7-8 says this, "What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would have not known what coveting really was if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin is dead." We don't know anything about grace. We wouldn't even have the word grace if it wasn't for sin in our life. Grace would have no effect. Grace would have nothing to do with us if there was not sin in our life. Let me put it in a different context, just kind of aside from this. It's like saying this. We would never understand a no unless there was a yes. To say it another way, we would never understand a yes unless there was a no. These are words in contrast to each other that define each other. These are words in comparison to each other that tell us what they mean, that tell us what they are. Either of those words have no validity, no valid reason to use them if they didn't and they weren't used in contrast to the opposite word. We would not understand grace had it not been for sin. And so if it's unmerited, if it's not something we can achieve, then the question is, what do I really deserve for the sin that I've committed? What are the consequences of sin? Luke 12:5 said, "But I will show you whom you should fear." This is Jesus talking. "Fear him who after your body has been killed has the authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him." Wow. That's pretty heavy stuff. Matthew 23:33, Jesus said, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" Yes, we're talking about hell. And some of you might think, well, that's not very nice. That's not very fair, talking about hell. There you go, all that negative stuff again. Listen, if I've been good, if I'm a good person, do I still deserve that? You're talking about hell. Friend, listen to this. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Because God does not rule, does not grade on a curve. God demands absolute performance, absolute perfection. It is 100% that you must achieve, that you must merit to get into his eternity, to get into his salvation, to get into his kingdom. 100%, all the time, 100% of the time, every act, every breath, every thought, everything that you've ever done, 100% is pure, is honorable, is so good that you deserve heaven. God doesn't grade on a curve. 100% is an A, but 99.9999999% is an F. That's right. 99.99% is still an F. So is 60% an F. So is 20% an F. And all of those that are in the F category are in the same boat. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that I worry about the most today. The greatest danger is when we become numb to sin and begin to deceive ourselves into thinking that what is sin is not sin. Isaiah 5:20 tells us about that. It says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, who try to flip things, who try to change things, who try to say that what was once sin is no longer sin, what was once evil is no longer evil. In fact, it's good. And what was once good is no longer good, it's evil." When our culture is trying to flip things and blur the lines like our culture is doing today, that's the greatest danger, because then we no longer recognize what sin is. And if we can no longer recognize what sin is, we no longer understand what grace is. Many in the culture are trying to say that what was once sin is no longer sin. They're blurring the lines. They're making it cloudy. They're trying, in fact, to redefine sin or ignore it altogether. Folks, grace doesn't negate sin. If I sin, or maybe I should say, when I sin and receive God's grace, what I did was still sin. That was still sin that I did. It's God's grace that I received, but it's my sin that I did. And the consequences of what we deserve for our sin is chilling. Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages, what we've earned, of sin is death." For the wages, what we've earned, what we've merited, what we've worked for, everything we've done, the wages of our sin is the death. Yeah. Eternal death. Permanent death. The death in which we will be cast away from God and from his pleasure. Death in which we will not have a fun time. Let me tell you. But you say, well, I've been, or so-and-so has been, such a good person. How can you say they've sinned, let alone that they deserve death? Well, that underscores one of the big misunderstandings. Because, folks, there's two aspects to sin. First of all, we have what's called a sin nature. We're born into sin. We inherited sin. Sin is in our DNA. It's baked into us. Psalm 51 verse 5 said, "For I was born a sinner, yes, from the moment my mother conceived me." I was born a sinner. That's who I am. It's in my DNA. It's in my bloodstream. It's in my life. Because of Adam and Eve's sin, the original sin, that tainted everything. We're all in this state where we're born in this sin nature. And that reveals this great truth. Please understand this. If you hear anything, understand this. Folks, we sin because we're sinners. We're not sinners because we sin. We sin because it's our nature, because we're sinners. We sin because it's in our DNA. We sin because we're sinners. We don't sin just independent of that. And then there's our actual sin, the things that we do because we're sinners. But we are sinners and we do sin. 1 John 1:8 says, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. But how does grace work? What does grace do? Grace of Jesus Christ releases us from the consequences that we deserve. Romans 6:14 says, for sin shall no longer be your master because you're not under the law, but under grace. We're under the canopy of grace. We're under the covering of grace that Jesus Christ gives to us. Ephesians 2:8 says, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith in Jesus Christ. And this is not from yourselves. It's a gift from God. It's not from yourselves because you merited it. It's not from yourselves because you worked for it. It's not from yourself because you're so good. It is a gift given only by God through Jesus Christ. So, how does grace work? Well, number one, grace releases us from the consequence of our sin, the penalty that we deserve. It doesn't say that sin is not sin. It doesn't say that sin is okay. It doesn't say that coveting or lust or greed or pride or hate is not sin and that it's okay. It doesn't say any of that. It releases the consequences of our sin. Number two, grace covers us. It protects us. It shields us because we are protected, shielded, and covered by Jesus Christ himself. And number three, grace embraces us with the love of the Father. It's that beautiful picture, that wonderful picture of the prodigal who ran away from home, the prodigal who lived a life of sin, the prodigal that knew he did wrong, and one day he wakes up in his own mire, in the pit of his desperation, realizing what he did. And he thinks, I'm going to go back home, maybe to be a servant for my father alongside of the other servants. I'm going to go back home because my life was better then, even though my father will probably not take me back, even though my father will probably give me penalty, even though my father will probably hate me forever because of what I've done, because I've run away from him. And that picture of the son coming home. And the father knows he's coming. And what does the father do? He runs to the son with his arms open wide, and he embraces his son and takes him back as his son forever and ever. That, my friend, is grace. And so, my friend, if you're interested in grace, if you want God's grace to be upon you, here are some things you need to do. Number one, call sin what it is. It's sin. Confess, admit, agree with this, that you are a sinner. No matter how good you are, you're still a sinner. And because of that, number three, confess your need for the substitution of Christ for our consequence and for the covering he offers. And number four, humble yourself. This takes humility. Humble yourself and give yourself over to Jesus Christ. Accept his grace. Live for him. Have a life with him. And Christ forever will embrace you and cover you and your sin. That's your devotional for today. And if you have supported this channel, thank you so much. If you'd like to support it, send me an email to john@johnelzinga.com. Let me know you'd like to be a supporter of the channel, and I'll send you a link that will allow you to make a donation. Well, God bless you, and remember, it's a great day to serve the Lord.